So in terms of how we're representing things, we kind of maybe saw this a little bit before, but profit, we're going to use pi to symbolize profit. And what profit is total revenues, if we remember from the first year, minus total costs. And we're talking about economic profit here, which we'll have to talk about. And so let's keep it really, really general at first. And think about a firm that can produce many different types of goods and that uses many different types of inputs. Then as we go on, we're going to kind of simplify things by maybe looking at firms that just produce one output and maybe have one or two inputs. So if firms produce n different kinds of outputs, so n outputs, so these are like different products that they're making or something like that. And so we might represent that by y1, y2, yn. So there's n different kind of outputs that this firm produces. And to produce these, maybe I'll say uses, and uses m inputs. So we're going to call the inputs with these x1, that's input 1, that's the amount of input 1. We have x2 is input 2, and then we have xm is input m. Then if prices of outputs are represented by P1 all the way up to Pn. So these prices these are the prices for these outputs. In prices of inputs, we're going to use W for prices of inputs. So W1 is the price of input 1, W2 is the price of input 2, all the way up to Wm is the price of input m. Then profits are, again, so pi for profits. We're going to keep things really general, but we're going to come back to just maybe 1. Then profit equals the sum. So this is a sum symbol from I equals 1 to n of pi times yi. So this is like total revenue, the price of the good times how much we're producing, and we're just summing up all over all our different kinds of products we're making, minus total costs, which are the sum. Again, this is my ugly sum symbol. I equals 1, and now we're going to go to m. So we have m different kinds of inputs. And it'll be the cost of the input times the amount of the input we use. So again, think of this as total revenue, and this is total costs. Now it's important we think of these costs, we're including all the costs. And so total costs, we're including opportunity costs. And so really what we're talking about here is like economic profit, not accounting profit. And so if you remember from first year in your past econ courses, the difference between economic and accounting profit is these implicit costs. And so we're including these implicit costs in our calculation. So even if the owner, even if there's just one owner and they're working, we should be counting, their opportunity costs of their time or their capital in terms of money. What they could otherwise be doing with that land. So I think the book is an example of like a farmland and a farmer. And what she should be thinking about is not only the cost of operating her land, but what she could also be using the land, what other products to grow, or if she could sell it to something else. The way to be a bit careful with flows and time that we're talking about here. But I just want to make it clear we're using It's economic profit. So we should be using, or including implicit costs, so opportunity costs are in these costs. Okay, let me quickly erase this and let's just be clear about how we're talking about flows. About amounts of inputs and outputs in terms of flows. Over some period. Over some time period. And usually like some of the confusion that comes up in terms of calculating profits is because we're not thinking in terms of these flows. So for instance, we're thinking about an input of labor. We might be thinking in terms of the amount, it's hours of labor a week. And so the costs we might think about is in terms of the hourly wage. What I mean by that is hourly wage. Ugly way of putting hourly wage. In terms of capital, this is it's a bit different to think about capital in terms of these flows over some period of time. Capital, like physical capital. Now we're going to think of like hours of machinery used per week, if that. I know that's kind of weird to think. Hours of machinery or something a week. And the weird thing about capital is we have to think of people owning, let's say, computers and things like that, which are maybe some examples of physical capital you use in a production process, or some kind of robots or something like that, or some kind of production process. And usually like firms own that, but if we need to make sure we match up the time period for all these different types of inputs. So here, instead of thinking about the cost of hours per week, we're going to use something called like the rental rate. And so this is kind of something that we would have to compute. Like this would be the cost of basically using that machinery for, let's say, if it's a week, if that's our flow period, like a week, and then selling it back afterwards. Or just like renting it for a week. So I'm just going to write that out, like the rental rate. This is like the cost of capital is going to be what we call the rental rate of capital. So a rental rate might seem strange, as companies often own. Physical capital. But again, we have to make sure we're matching the time period that we're looking at, because we're going to be calculating profit over some time period, like a week or a month or a year or whatever, or in the short run or long run or whatever. And so we need to compute the rental rate, the costs, of using capital for the time period. Sorry for the squeaking, it's a new board. The time period, which we're going to call the rental rate again. Just to make sure we're looking at the same period in terms of inputs and outputs. Okay, the other thing we'll say about, the textbook goes through a couple other sections, which are about the organization of the firm, and explains, how firms can be sole proprietorships, they can be partnerships, they can be corporations, but they're all kind of owned by individuals at some level. Even corporations, people own stocks in them, and basically the idea is that they have the board, and the board's hiring these directors and stuff like that that are still like looking out for the owners of the company, just like legally separating the entities a bit. no matter what the organization of the firm, we're just gonna assume that they're maximizing profits. That's an assumption we're gonna make, so we're kind of gonna abstract from the organization of the firm. The other thing the text talks about is kind of this idea behind stock prices and present value of future profits and things like that. We're not gonna cover that aspect of it. We're just gonna thinking about how firms are gonna choose their inputs and how much output they're gonna get as a result that maximizes profit. So we're gonna kind of skip those sections of the text just so that's clear.